I used to work in a small office near Park Street. I was kind of broke back then, and the only place I could afford was a small apartment a few blocks from the subway every single morning. It was a hassle just to find a spot on the train where I wouldn't get elbowed or touched inappropriately. Local trains give you the experience of a lifetime, especially when you're a young woman. You're always in the spotlight whether you like it or not. Every so often, some random guy would give you that unsettling smile that creeps you out, or some would try to stand a little too close. I got used to it in time, or at least I pretended to. It's just part of the daily grind. One day at the office, my boss informed me that I had to stay late. When I tried to ask him why, he just shrugged and said one of my colleagues was sick and I had to analyze the reports he'd left behind. Those reports were way above my pay grade, by the way. I hesitantly tried to suggest that this wasn't exactly in my job description, but he just cut me off. Maybe he assumed I had no life outside that stupid soul-crushing office of his. Then he just shoved the papers at me without listening to anything I had to say. By the time I got to the station, the sun had already set, and it was getting darker every second. My feet were screaming for rest, and I swear, they felt like they would give out completely. All I craved at that time was to get home and collapse on my couch, and then just eat those frozen pizza slices I'd left in the freezer that morning. The subway wasn't quite as crammed as it was during rush hour. There were just a handful of exhausted late-night commuters waiting to go home. But luckily, I actually found a whole bench near the door all to myself. It had been almost a week since I'd managed to snag a seat on the train. I gave a small chuckle. It was a moment of relief in a long day. I got comfortable and started scrolling through my phone. But then I noticed a man smoking in front of me near the door. He looked like he was in his mid-30s, maybe a little younger. I didn't like people who smoked, and I knew smoking wasn't allowed inside the train. But since no one was saying anything to him, so I just tried to ignore him too. But then his eyes met mine, and he started staring right at me. It wasn't just a glance. It was a direct stare, and very creepy too. I pretended like I didn't notice him and started focusing on my phone. It's not like guys don't stare, it's part of the deal. But this was different. It felt invasive, like he was looking at my soul. I put my headphones on, blasting some random song I can't even recall now. And then, without me even noticing, he was sitting right next to me. I panicked. This guy was a real creep, there's no doubt about it. Plus, the smoke from his cigarette was making it hard to breathe. It was disgusting. Why was he doing this? The entire place was practically empty. Just as I was trying to figure out what his intentions were, he stared at me again. It was a slow, deliberate look. I felt the knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. I braced myself, thinking he was going to say something or make an unwanted approach. But instead he just offered me a cigarette. He said it helped him with stress. I was confused and didn't care about anything. I declined and asked if he could maybe smoke somewhere else. He looked a little disappointed, even a little angry at me. He told me that women my age drink and smoke all the time. He suggested I should try it sometime. I was getting frustrated. I refused again with a slightly sharper voice this time. I told him that he needed to smoke somewhere else or I was going to call for help. He completely ignored me, like he didn't care about my opinion. Then he started rambling some nonsense about how the city was full of awful people and how hard it was to find genuine people like me. I didn't acknowledge him and just grabbed my bag and moved to another bench behind him. I tried to get as far away as I could and kept an eye on him the whole ride. He glanced back at me a few times with a creepy look on his face, but I pretended I didn't see him. As the train started to slow down, I thought about how to get out without him noticing. I had to get away from him. The train doors were opening and everyone was starting to get up. I stood up too, ready to rush out, but the guy wasn't moving. I was scared. I knew he was waiting for me. Without thinking, I pushed my way through the crowd and tried to get away before he noticed. My apartment was just a few blocks away. I practically started sprinting, glancing behind me every few seconds. I was expecting him right behind me. I was praying and hoping that he wouldn't follow me. I couldn't let him know where I had lived. It was just a few minutes before I reached my building. It was completely dark, and the streetlights in my area were quite dim, so it was hard to see anyone coming from a distance. There was an alley that leads to a shortcut to my apartment. I kept walking thinking maybe I'm finally safe, but then while coming out of the alley, I saw a man standing under the streetlight. He was wearing a hoodie and looking at his phone while leaning on the lamppost. I didn't think it could be him, but when the bright screen made his face visible under the hoodie, I realized it was him. My blood ran cold. He was following me. I acted like I didn't see him, my legs moving faster. I was almost running, trying to get away as fast as I could. I knew I had to be smart. I couldn't let him know where I lived. Then he started walking faster too. My mind was whirling. I was trying to figure out what to do, and just when I thought I was trapped, I saw the diner near my apartment was still open. I finally found the last bit of hope. I started to run, but he was almost behind me. I sprinted toward the diner. He tried to grab me by the hair but failed. I slammed the door and ran inside the diner. The woman who owned the diner knew me. Her name was Jessie. Jessie asked me if there was any problem, but I was struggling for air. I looked outside through the glass, but there was no one. He was gone, almost like he vanished into the night. After that, I started crying. When I told Jessie everything, she was angry. She went outside to see if he was still there, but no, she didn't find anyone out there. I never saw that guy in my life. I barely told anyone this story, and even now it's still unsettling to remember it. I've been a sheriff for 7 years now, and my vision on life completely changed after that. I discovered the difference between movies and reality with my own experience. I really have to be brave enough to adjust to the dark and must love the quiet to become a sheriff. Furthermore, I saw things that people would only hear in the local news or through rumors, things that most people find hard to believe. That night, I was on a highway near County Road 42. The air was cold, and my skin was getting dry from the arid breeze. The sky was moonlit with long shadows cast around the fields. I was doing my usual patrols and cruising in the absolute darkness. But then I saw something in the woods. It was a faint glow coming from the old farm. It was unusual. The farm had been abandoned for years. I quietly killed the engine and slowly started approaching. The silence was thick. The only thing that can be heard was the distant hoot of an owl. I cautiously started walking into the woods, slowly approaching the farm. The glow was getting brighter and I started hearing fire crackling. Then I saw everything. There was a man sitting by the fire. He was wearing a worn jacket and a filthy hat. I stepped forward, the dry leaves crunching under my boots. He turned back to see who it was, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. It was a young man. I informed him that it was the sheriff's office, but he just stood there without giving me any response. I asked if he could show me his ID. He still didn't answer, just kept staring at me. I asked him again in a dominant tone that I needed some ID. A wave of fear rushed over him. He was left frozen. I asked him if he was okay, but then he started running toward the clearing. I ran behind trying to stop him. He knew this place very well. He was running in the dark without any hesitation. I followed him with my flashlight beam bouncing through the woods. Then I heard an engine running on my left. Before I could reach him, the guy took a turn and started speeding through the narrow road. I kept pointing my gun at him, yelling for him to stop, but he was going into the darkness, leaving the dust behind. Without wasting more time, I sprinted toward the cruiser. A rush of adrenaline coursed through me. I knew I had to catch him. I turned the engine and floored it, the cruiser roaring down the road. It had become a chase. I knew how the situation was, so I called for reinforcements. I caught up to the car, but the car turned into a narrow dirt road, disappearing into the dust cloud. I followed, my headlights cutting through dirt. However, it was still not enough because the car was gone. I slammed on the brakes, my cruiser skidding to a stop. I tried to find the car from inside the cabin, but I didn't see anything. I stepped out of the cruiser, my hand resting in my sidearm. I knew he was watching me from somewhere, but I didn't know where he was. I looked over the field, but no sign of the guy. I was only able to see some cactuses and small blackthorn trees in the distance. I was thinking to myself that maybe I had lost him, so I was going to the station to issue a bolo on him. The car didn't have any license plate on it, but I remembered his face very well as I was heading toward my cruiser to head to the station. But when I turned back, I was shocked. The guy was standing in front of me. He was in between me and my car. I aimed my Glock right at him. I told him to put his hands behind his back, but he was still not moving an inch or giving any replies. I was confused. He should have been cowering in fear after seeing a gun pointed right at him. But just then I heard a click behind me. I realized it was a trap. They were trying to lure me. The young guy was the bait, and I took it without thinking. The other guy came from behind me holding an old rifle. He pointed it right at me, telling me to drop my gun. I was panicking, my life flashing before my eyes. This type of experience was entirely new for me. The man yelled at me, wavering his rifle. He told me I should drop the gun. I hesitated at first, but I knew I couldn't do anything. Without any other options, I lowered my hands, dropping the gun as he wanted. I was alone. There was no way for retreat. I tried to stall for time and asked what they had wanted, but the old guide told me not to say anything or he would shoot. I was checking around the clearing, trying to find any hope of escape route. I hoped reinforcements were on their way, but I couldn't count on that to arrive in time. I stayed quiet, the silence amplifying the sound of my own heavy breathing. I tried to reason with him, saying whatever he wants is not going to happen. He yelled at me again and told me not to say another word. There was no way to escape, no way to reason with the guy. I took a step closer, hoping to get a better look at him. He shouted, ordering me to stop moving, and then I heard a loud bang deafening me. My ears rang from the force of that sound. The sound echoed through the clearing like thunder shattering the sky. It was a gunshot. My life flashed before my eyes. Terrified, I braced myself for the impact. I held my chest as hard as I could, but when I looked down, I didn't see what I expected. There was no blood on my chest, but the old man was screaming, clutching his bloody hand in pain. Then I saw multiple footsteps approaching me from the distance. They were cops, hiding behind the oak trees, waiting for the moment to strike. I realized they shot the man's hand, preventing him from pulling the trigger. We arrested both of them. The cops asked me to come to the station, but I refused. I went straight home. My hands were shaking as I took off my clothes. I was traumatized. I couldn't believe I made it out alive. I didn't sleep that night. I kept smoking on the porch. The next day, I woke up on the porch with ashes all over me. I took a shower and went to the station. My friends at the station found out that those two weren't just some random thieves. They were part of something big. The beat-up sedan wasn't just a getaway vehicle. It was a rolling evidence locker. There was money, some gold, and a map with locations spread all across 4 counties. Locations that corresponded to some recent carjacking and even a couple of cold case homicides. I cannot tell you anything else due to the protocols, but we found a jackpot worth of unsolved cases, and after some weeks we pieced everything together. It's been 3 years since that incident, but I still can't believe what happened. I've been looking for a job since last month. I was getting desperate with so many unpaid bills piled up. I applied for so many jobs, but the rejection letters kept coming. At that time, I was ready to do anything for some money. One night, I got a letter from a company called Apex Solutions. The letter mentioned an interview scheduled next week at a place in the suburban areas of Bakersfield, out on the edge of town. The letter seemed kind of unprofessional to me. It didn't have a proper description of the post or the company itself, just a congratulation for being selected. It didn't even mention the exact time for the interview either. I had never heard of a company named Apex Solutions in my entire career, but I figured I may have applied and forgotten about the company since I did a lot of applying that month. The interview was a chance I could pay the bills, so without hesitating, I took it and prepared to go for the interview. The next day, I woke up early and prepared for the interview. I took a shower and took the formal clothes from the closet. The location from the email was 7 miles away from my apartment. I got there early, but the parking lot was completely empty. There were no cars or anything that gave off office vibes. At first I thought that maybe I came to the wrong address, so I checked my phone to look at the email again. But according to the email, it was the same address. That was the correct place. There were a few uncleaned, overgrown weeds poking out of the cracks in the sidewalk. This definitely didn't look like some kind of headquarters. I waited in my car for a bit, figuring maybe I was just super early at the place. But half an hour passed and no one showed up. I went inside thinking maybe it's not how it looked from the outside, but the place was just the same on the inside. The entire area was empty. There was no one at the reception, just a dusty table and a couple of chairs that looked like they had been through a war. On the right side, there was a hallway leading off to who knows where. This was not what I expected before coming to the place. It felt like the whole place had been abandoned for decades. I turned back and was ready to leave the place. But then a guy came out of the hallway. He was a tall, middle-aged guy wearing a suit and tie. The man introduced himself as Alex. He looked professional and asked me if I was there for the interview. I nodded and asked him what the company was actually about. He didn't answer and told me to come with him to the office. He led me down the hallway, but it was even creepier there. No open windows, no other employees. Just the footsteps of Alex and me in a hallway that led to dark, empty rooms. I asked Alex if it was a holiday or something since no one was around. He said it was a holiday and they were moving the main office uptown. The employees were working from home, so in the meantime he had the opportunity to take some interviews. I felt relieved. It was not a scam or anything. Alex then stopped at a door and gestured for me to go in. It was a small, empty room except for 2 chairs and a desk at the corner. The air was thick and some strange smell was coming from the room. I didn't find a single company logo or any pictures on the wall. Nothing. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt off about it even though Alex said they were moving. Alex sat across from me. He told me to sit and started asking me some usual interview questions. I answered him and told him about all the companies and places I had worked before. He nodded to every word I said, but the way he kept looking at me was a little alarming. I was used to men staring at me before. As a woman, you have to deal with it every day. I thought maybe I was being paranoid. But then Alex asked me if I lived alone. It was unnerving. The question had nothing to do with the job. I tried to steer the conversation back to the job, asking what role I would be given. He just tilted his head like he didn't hear me say it. He then said, "Let's skip the formalities. We should know each other first." It was getting too personal now. I told him some random nonsense about team building and contributing to a team, but he just stared at me, giving me a creepy smile. He said it was important to know what kind of person he was working with. I just sat there screaming from the inside. I regretted entering this empty building. It was a big fat no after meeting the guy. I told him it was nice meeting him, but I didn't think this was the right fit for me. He then stood up. He wasn't smiling anymore, just a cold, emotionless expression on his face. He asked me in a low and menacing voice if I didn't think he was good enough for me. I didn't answer. I just bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him yelling behind me. He was shouting at me to come back. Alex rushed toward me. He almost grabbed me by my hair, but luckily I was able to close the door. He was slamming at the door, twisting the doorknob to open it. I held the doorknob as hard as I could, but I was filled with hope when I saw it. Alex accidentally left the key in the doorknob. I turned the key and locked Alex inside the room. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, cursing me to open the door. I ran down the hallway as fast as I could. I rushed towards the parking lot. The car was parked in the middle of the lot. I was shaking while unlocking the car. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was standing behind the car. How was this possible? How did he get out so fast? I didn't think much. I floored the car, the tires screeching as I sped away from there. Alex didn't move an inch. He just stood there. The image of his face burned into my mind. I went straight home after that. For a few days, I kept receiving random emails from different companies asking me to meet at the same address. I was scared to even get out of my place. I knew it had something to do with Alex. He was trying to lure me again with those emails. It was almost 3 a.m. I was on the road, somewhere between Denver and Nashville. I was exhausted and wanted to take a break before I started hallucinating. The highway stretched out like an endless black ribbon, seeming as if it would never end. And my eyes were burning like hell too. All I wanted was to get out of the car and get some coffee, but luck wasn't on my side. But then after some time I saw a flickering neon sign near a gas station. The sign said Mary's Diner, with the D flickering like it was about to go out. Usually I was never the kind of person to stop at roadside diners at those hours, but desperation makes you do things you wouldn't normally consider. I really needed a break, and my tank was half empty too. So I pulled off the road and headed toward the parking lot with a sharp turn. The parking lot was completely empty as expected. The only thing visible was the faded blue of the disabled sign on the other side of the area. The diner looked old with all the chrome and the faded turquoise paint. I pushed the doors open and went inside the glass door. A bell then jingled above my head. The inside was dimly lit with the smell of stale coffee and greasy food. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clinking of dishes from the kitchen. After a few minutes, an old woman with a tired face approached me. She had a faded name tag that said Mabel on her chest pocket. I asked for the strongest coffee they had and a slice of apple pie. I was hoping the sugar rush would help me stay awake. She nodded and asked me if I needed anything else before going inside the kitchen. I told her that would be it and sat on the booth waiting for my order. As I was waiting for my order, I saw a pair of dim headlights approaching slowly through the window. I saw an old Hilux with a slightly dented fender and a rusted-out bicycle strapped to its back. The truck then parked on the lot and a man came out of it. The man pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped inside the diner. As he stepped inside the diner, he glanced at me and sat on the booth in front of me, and then everything went dead silent as it was before. A few minutes passed and the coffee arrived, along with the pie. But it wasn't as good as I was expecting. The coffee was lukewarm, with a bitter taste, and the apple pie had a metallic aftertaste along with being overly sweet. I took a few bites of the apple pie, but the taste was too irritating to eat. I drank the coffee even though it was bitter. I had to get rid of the sleepiness. But then I noticed the man casting subtle glances from the table. He was watching me across the booth. I couldn't make out why he was doing that, but he was making it creepy. I didn't react to anything. I just paid the bill and left the place. But just then he asked me, "Leaving soon?" That was weird. I didn't answer him. I was trying to get to my car as fast as I could. But then he shouted, "I am not done with you." His tone was a little demanding now. I thought he was crazy. I started walking faster now. I pushed the door and stumbled out. I could hear the man approaching from behind me fast. I didn't stop. I could hear the shoes scraping against the floor as the guy was walking. I fumbled with my car keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. I started the engine, threw the car into gear and sped out of the parking lot. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw his shadowed figure against the dim light of the diner. I then shifted my sights towards the road and left the parking lot with a sigh. As I was driving, I thought to myself, where did the woman from the diner go when all this happened? Was she really planning to trap me with him, or was I just imagining things? I didn't think much of it. I just kept driving without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the town. I pulled over to the gas station. I sat there for a while after filling the tank. Even 10 years later, this story still haunts me when I think about how I came out of there without any harm. I was a nobody when I was young. I lived with my Uncle Joe in a small house, and my Aunt Connie was not a generous woman either. I know what it's like to be a burden to others. I lived in the spare room tucked under the stairs. It was barely the size of a closet, but back then I used to think of myself as Harry Potter. I had to get the chores done in order to stay there. Dishes, clothes, mopping the floor, cleaning the bathroom, taking out the trash, mowing the lawn. I was in charge of everything. It was an exchange of labor for shelter, and it was hell for me. But the only one in the house who didn't treat me like a slave was my cousin Ava. We were really close. We used to share everything, finding comfort in each other's company. You could say I didn't end up being screwed up because of her, but Ava had to leave for college. Her college was 200 miles away. She moved there to a rented apartment with her boyfriend. After she left the house, it hadn't been the same. The house became cold and silent. Uncle Joe bought a dark blue Accord for Ava when she turned 18. Now it was just sitting in the garage, gathering dust. I asked Ava if it was okay for me to drive the car. She just handed me the keys and told me it was mine for as long as I wanted it. But my uncle had a different idea. He saw an opportunity after Ava handed me the keys. He said it's mine if I pay them a small rent for the car and do the maintenance with my own money. Ava argued, but she couldn't convince them. I thanked her and agreed to them. I was thinking maybe somehow I wouldn't be a burden to them anymore. I told them I would give them a small amount every single month if they let me use the car. That car was a reliable one. I used to think of it as a means of escape from the hell I lived in. I heard from my friends there was an old lady who needed a driver, someone to take her to appointments. Most people avoided her because she was demanding and called at all hours with a sharp and impatient voice. I hesitated at first too, but when I met her I found out that she had a chronic heart condition that flared up any time, and she had to be taken to the clinic right away. I didn't mind it. I needed the money, and she was kind to me in her own way. Underneath the grumpy stuff, she would talk for hours about her life, and I would share mine. I helped her with heavy groceries and stuff out of a sense of compassion. One day, my uncle gave me a small brown package and ordered me to deliver it to Ava. He also mentioned he had wired her some money and would find out if I asked her for money. I didn't tell him anything, just nodded and went out of his sight. I decided to visit Ava with the package. It's been a few months since I saw her. I traveled all the way to her apartment in the Accord. Her face lit up when she saw me. She then introduced me to her boyfriend. His name was Dan, and he was a tall, lanky guy and very shy. The apartment wasn't that flashy, but it was okay enough. Ava made coffee for all of us, and we had a lot of catching up to do. As I prepared to leave, Ava hugged me and apologized for how her parents treat me. I downplayed it and said I was thankful to her parents for letting me live with them. The drive back was long and lonely. I'd been driving for 2 solid hours with the radio as my only companion. I was tired, my eyes feeling heavy. I was thinking of grabbing a coffee from one of the diners, but then suddenly a car coming from the left intersection collided with me. At first, I didn't realize what happened. All I heard was a loud bang, and then the world started spinning. It felt like the world exploded in a blinding flash while everything was getting darker. It was getting hard for me to breathe. I noticed smoke coming from under the mangled hood. While I was getting ready to get out of my car, I heard the sound of an engine starting behind me. It was an old pickup truck. The engine started roaring. The truck started coming toward me with speed. Then it slammed into my car. I started feeling a sharp pain in my back. Then it hit me again. The truck started pushing me back toward the river. I was screaming, confused at what was happening. I was panicking. The doors were jammed. I didn't have the strength to break the window. The car sounded like it would crumple in mere moments. I tried to start the engine, but it completely gave up. The truck kept pushing me toward the edge of the road. I thought maybe this was the end. I started hearing angry screams from the truck. Whoever was inside the truck, he was mad at me for wrecking his truck. Later, I woke up in a hospital bed with machines and an oxygen mask attached to me. I had a plaster cast on my neck, right arm, and some bandages on my knee. I shouted for help and a nurse came to check. She informed me that a cop would come after a few minutes and I should not move too much for my own safety. Then the cop came through the door. He informed me about the truck owner. I finally learned why he'd done it. It wasn't just the anger that I'd slammed into his truck, even though that was part of it. He was furious because he saw my out-of-state plates, assuming I was some drunk rich kid ruining his day. So in that moment, fueled by anger and a dark, twisted sense of justice, he decided to make me pay. I couldn't believe that people like him even existed. It all started with a stupid party. Me and Dan, we were always looking for trouble back then, like we had something to prove. We heard some older kids were having a bonfire down by the old quarry. The place had this creepy reputation, all sorts of rumors about accidents and disappearances. But that night, we were feeling invincible. That night, Dan snuck in through my window and scared the crap out of me. I almost screamed at him with shock. Then he said he was going there and I should come too. I hesitated. Something about it felt off, even for us. But Dan was already hyped up, and I didn't want to look like a chicken, so I grabbed my jacket and we took off. It was a long walk, mostly through the woods. The only light was from the moon, which kept disappearing behind the clouds. It was quiet, too quiet. Just the rustling of leaves and the occasional snapping of a twig. Dan was talking about some girl he liked, but I wasn't really listening. I was busy trying to think about what would happen if my parents found out. But while we were out of the woods and crossing the road, suddenly a black SUV came screeching around the corner. It missed us by inches. I swear I saw my life flashing before my eyes. I felt the wind from it as it went by. Dan went nuts and started cursing at the driver. I was already shaken and his reaction just made it worse. Then the SUV slammed on its brakes. My heart started pounding. Dan, who was acting all tough a second ago, suddenly seemed to shrink. The SUV just sat there, its headlights blinding us. We couldn't see who was inside. It felt like forever. But then it just sped off. We were both breathing hard, adrenaline pumping. I remember thinking, what the hell was that all about? What kind of moron drives like that? We kept walking, but everything had changed. We didn't talk much. We were both on edge, waiting to finally get to the party. After some time, we reached the quarry. The party was in full swing with bonfire and party songs. But I couldn't relax. I kept looking behind me, still thinking about the car. I wasn't enjoying the party at all. A few minutes later, I told Dan I wanted to go back, and for the first time, he didn't argue with me. We finally made it back to my place, and I just went inside my room. Few weeks passed, and I almost forgot about the near-death incident. Dan and I kept going to school as usual, but one day, my dad told me he forgot to bring the eggs from Walmart, so he gave me money and told me to buy some eggs from the store. While I was returning from the store, I was thinking maybe I can visit Dan's house in the meantime, but then I saw the same black SUV parked near the road. My heart stopped. It was the same one. I was sure of it. I pulled myself and turned around the way I came. I didn't stop until I got to the main road. I knew I was in trouble, but I didn't know who was inside the car or what they wanted. The car started following me. I walked fast. Suddenly it sped up and came right beside me. It was hard to see who was inside the black tint, but then the windows rolled down. I saw two guys wearing black masks looking right at me. The guy swerved the car and tried to hit me. I jumped out of instinct and hit the ground. My heart pounded. I started to yell at them and asked what the hell they were doing, but they just left without any reply. I told Dan and decided we should tell our parents about this. He started arguing and said that we would get in trouble if we tell them, but I made up my mind. I couldn't stay quiet after what happened today. I told my mom everything, and she brought the news to my dad. They were mad at me. They told me not to go outside unless they let me. My dad called the cops and told them everything. I then told them how the SUV looked. We haven't heard anything about them for quite some time, but then after a month or so, the cops informed us that the two of them were arrested. They were trying to escape after injuring a cop. The cops said they had a record of harassing people in the past, and I was lucky I didn't get hurt. Whenever I remember the incident, I get scared thinking if they would come to me again for revenge. This happened in 2015. It was around the end of June. My friend Riley and I were just bored in the evening. Her parents left her at my place before going to a funeral. We played the gallerist for some time, but it wasn't that interesting since she didn't know how to play it. So we decided to take a walk outside. There was a mall just a few blocks away from home. Riley said we should check out the new restaurant near it too. She was always into this kind of stuff. I tagged along thinking I didn't have anything better to do. We started in a few of the smaller shops. Riley tried on a couple of rings, checking the way the light hit the fake stones. I was looking at some necklaces, trying to find something simple for my little sister Tara. We ended up in a little shop tucked away in a corner of the mall. We bought a thin silver chain for Riley and a little bracelet for Tara with small colored beads. We were about to leave and thinking about eating at the restaurant she mentioned, but Riley stumbled upon some random guy while counting her money. She was startled and scattered everything across the floor. It was embarrassing. The guy was a little older than us. Riley awkwardly apologized to the guy and started picking up the money. The guy said it was no big deal and he was a little careless too. We gave a smile to the guy and started to walk away from him. But then the guy started suggesting some random items we could try. I told him politely that we were done shopping and we didn't need anything else, but the guy kept pushing it, asking us to try a necklace he saw at a store. It was weird. At first I thought maybe the guy was an employee or something, but he wasn't wearing any name tag or any type of uniform. Riley tried to get away saying we were just leaving and she could try it next time she visits. But as we were walking, the guy started following us. We knew something was off. We needed to get rid of him. The guy then shouted at us to stop and told us to come to the shop near him. We ignored him, pretending we didn't hear him, but things got stranger. He kept following us throughout the entire mall. Riley and I exchanged nervous glances. We started walking faster, our pace turning into a near jog. We didn't look back, just kept our eyes forward, trying to appear calm, but my heart was pounding inside. We spotted a service exit leading to the parking lot. I whispered to Riley to duck through the door. We ran down a dimly lit hallway, our footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. We were lost, but we kept walking. We finally burst into the parking lot. Then we looked back to see if the guy was still following us, but he wasn't there. An overwhelming sense of relief washed over us. Riley pleaded with me not to talk about this, saying her parents wouldn't let her leave the house if they heard about it. We started walking towards the streets, trying to get home as quickly as we could. But while we were walking towards the sidewalk, we saw him again standing in front of us. He was walking towards us, his eyes fixed while approaching us. I panicked. Without thinking, I grabbed Riley's arm and pulled her closer. We started walking faster, trying to make some distance from that creep. Riley started yelling at me, saying he was gaining on us. We were trapped. There was nowhere to go. We looked around frantically. We held each other and started running as fast as we could. Then he started running too. My home wasn't that far away from the place, but we knew we couldn't get there in time. We were in real trouble. But just then my eyes widened with hope. A cop was taking a coffee break outside of his car. We sprinted toward the cop. We shouted at the cop to get his attention. He was startled. We were gasping for air while the officer was looking surprised. After catching our breath, we explained to him about everything. The officer was shocked. He told us to stay close to him and looked around to see if the guy was still there. But no, he was gone, almost as if he had disappeared. The officer then asked a bunch of questions about how the guy looked and took some notes while we explained. We told him everything about how the guy approached us and how he followed us since we left the mall. The officer said it wasn't safe to walk our way home and told us to get in his car. We went inside without any hesitation. When my mom saw us stepping out of a police car, she was worried sick. We told her everything, figuring we didn't have any choice. We spent the rest of the night thinking about the whole situation. It was a terrifying experience. It still makes me uneasy whenever I think about it. I used to go for hikes with my dad when I was a kid. Those were some of the best memories of my life. He used to teach me all sorts of things. I learned everything I knew about the wilderness from him. Things like reading a map, using a compass, how to track animals, and respect the power of nature. Those days it was just the two of us, and the endless adventures. We used to explore trails, and he shared so many of his stories with me. But sadly, it didn't last long. He passed away a few years ago, and without him I couldn't feel the connection I used to share with nature before. But one day, I decided to go hiking to honor his memories in my own way. I felt like it was my own way of feeling close to him, to feel like he was standing beside me, leading me to the wild. I was thinking about going to the Redwood National Park for some time. It was the kind of challenge he would have wanted. I spent weeks poring over maps and trail guides, learning about the rugged terrain and the steep climbs. It was terrifying, just as I had wanted. I was in good shape, had all the right equipment. I was ready to embrace the challenge that was about to come. It felt like my dad was daring me to prove myself. The park itself was a hiker's paradise. The ground, covered by the tall redwood trees, formed a cathedral of green. The air was crisp and cool, along with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I had set off early in the morning, eager to explore the trails. The trailhead was deserted, but it wasn't surprising. Most people choose the other popular and easy trails, but I liked the solitude. It gave me a sense of freedom, of being alone with my memories. The first few miles were relatively easy. The trail elevated its way to the dense forest, but as I climbed higher, the trail became more challenging. The path narrowed, and the terrain grew steeper than before. The trees seemed to close in around me. Also, the sunlight that had been dappling through the canopy earlier was now almost completely blocked out. The air grew colder too, but I didn't stop. I embraced the difficulties head-on. I reached a certain section of the trail that hugged the edge of a steep cliff. There were no guardrails, no safety nets, just a narrow path with a sheer drop on one side. I could hear the wind whistling, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. I cautiously edged my way along, my eyes fixed on the path ahead. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It felt like something was following me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the endless rows of trees, their shadows stretching out like long, grasping claws. I was halfway from the end, but the trail didn't seem to end. But when I checked my watch, I realized I was running out of time. I had to reach the summit before nightfall, or I'd have to spend the entire night alone in the dark forest. I picked up my pace, ignoring the growing pain in my legs. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the heart of the forest. The trees grew denser, their branches interlocking overhead. It was getting dark quickly, the shadows becoming deeper, and the area became more quiet. I still wasn't able to see the end of it. I switched on my headlamp. By then, it became completely dark. Even the occasional hoots of an owl could be heard in the distance. The headlamp only illuminated a small area of the trail, leaving the rest dark. It made me nervous. I was never on a hike this late before. As time went by, the air grew thick. The silence made it difficult to breathe without noticing. But the feeling of being watched gave me goosebumps. It wasn't just some intuition. It was a feeling entirely different. Just then, I heard a faint rustling in the distance. The feeling persisted. It was like the forest itself was alive. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I held my headlamp steady, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Then I heard another rustle, but this one was closer this time. And then a low growl emanated from the depth of the forest. It wasn't the sound of any animal I had heard before. It was something different. My blood ran cold. I realized I wasn't alone there. I wasn't just being watched, I was being hunted. I ran as fast as I could, my feet scraping on the uneven trail. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to escape whatever was stalking me. The growls grew louder, more closer. I could hear the rustling of leaves near me. During the rush, I stumbled on a root and went sprawling, my headlamp flying from my grasp. Everything went dark. I took out the backup flashlight from my pocket. I was trembling. The thought of a predator lurking nearby terrified me. But when I searched my surroundings, I was shocked. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. I saw a human-like figure, taller than the trees, standing in front of me. Its eyes glowed in the darkness. I screamed at the top of my lungs. A primal scream of terror echoed through the dark forest. I turned and ran again, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I felt the searing pain in my feet, like hot knives slicing through my flesh. But then the growl stopped. It was gone as if it was never there. The entire area was quiet again. I laid there, gasping for air, my whole body shaking. I didn't know what it was or what was the purpose behind all this. But I didn't give up. I kept going until I reached the trailhead. I was exhausted. I was terrified. But more importantly, I was alive. My buddy Jake and I worked at a nearby Walmart store. We had known each other since 5th grade. Between the two of us, he's always been a hothead, but I liked that about him. We'd been living in Cosby our entire lives and knew everything about each other. One day, Jake suggested we should go somewhere, take a break before we died here. I wasn't much of a fun guy myself, but after hearing him, it felt right. So after some hesitation, I agreed. I asked Jake what he was planning. He suggested a road trip would be a great idea. So as soon as we got our next PTO, we started planning the trip. Jake suggested we take his car instead of mine. He had recently bought a Corolla, and it's a pretty reliable car. He said his car would save us some gas money compared to mine. I didn't argue. I told him I was okay if he drove the car. We left our houses at dawn to welcome the change. Jake blasted some 90s music, and the trip started. After some driving and having a lot of fun, Jake pulled over at a turn on the road where a beautiful waterfall cascaded down. He then started getting all philosophical about nature and said we should admire its beauty. I told him that it's his inner poet speaking and maybe he should think about his career choice. We headed back in the evening with a sigh. We wished we could do this more frequently. It was getting darker, along with a rapid drop in temperature. Everything was getting foggier, and cars were now only visible through the headlights. After some time, light snow started dusting the windshield. The only thing visible was the occasional glint of Coyote's eyes in the distance. Jake was driving nonstop, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I barely slept last night, so I decided to take a nap and told Jake to wake me up if he wanted to switch. But just as I was falling asleep, the Corolla started jerking. Then I heard the engine sputtering. Jake started pressing the gas over and over, but the car was completely dead. No matter how many times he tried, it wouldn't turn on. As we were getting out of the car, the dashboard lights flickered, and then we saw smoke coming from the engine. We opened the hood and checked if the car was on fire. Neither of us knew how to fix a car, and the engine looked totally normal to us. Jake went inside and tried to start the car again, but no matter what, the car wouldn't start. Frustrated, Jake started kicking a tire. I regretted not taking my car, but it wasn't usual for a Corolla to turn off in the middle of the road. It was inevitable. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere. No cell phone service, no passing cars. We really were in trouble. We stayed inside the car, but without the heater, the cabin was getting colder every minute. Our breath started fogging the windows. Jake then declared that if we didn't do something, we would probably freeze to death. After shivering in the cold, we realized we were going to freeze to death. But to our shock, we saw headlights appearing in the rearview mirror. Then a rusty Maverick pulled over in front of us. An elderly woman stepped out of the car. She approached us and asked if we were stuck. Jake explained everything about how the car stopped. She introduced herself as Sarah and told us she could help. She said that it had happened to her once, which is why she helps others stuck in the snow. Sarah seemed genuine, but something about her felt off. It may sound a little paranoid, but people don't usually pull over for strangers if they are alone. However, it shouldn't be surprising that she was just a kind-hearted lady trying to help us out. But then Sarah told us that her husband was a mechanic, but he would only fix our car if we paid extra. So that's why she was helping us. She was just finding some customers on the way. Jake and I agreed and jumped inside the truck. The truck felt warm, which was what we needed for a few hours. We relaxed while Sarah was driving us to her home. After some time, I started noticing something. Sarah kept staring at us through the mirror while she was driving. Then I saw her using her phone for something. I was confused, thinking what she was doing, but strangely she kept looking at us over and over. I tried to tell Jake about it somehow, but he was busy enjoying the warmth. When I looked at the window, I saw tall trees surrounding us. We were not on the highway anymore. Sarah was taking us somewhere else. I asked her if we were going the right way. She said that it was a shortcut to her house, but the way she said that with an emotionless voice, unlike when she first met us, it gave me chills. I told Sarah to stop the truck. She completely ignored me. Jake asked me what happened. I yelled at Sarah, telling her to stop the truck. She tightened her grip and told us that we were not far away from her house. The warm cabin grew cold. I exchanged a terrified look with Jake. We thought about how to get out of the situation. I knew we were in deep trouble. The silence in the truck was thick, punctuated only by the rumble of the engine. As Sarah slowed down for a sharp curve, I acted on instinct, grabbing her from behind. I told her to stop the truck or I would choke her to the end. She slammed on the brakes, struggling for air. The truck swerved and started slowing down. Jake took the keys of her truck and threw it in the dark. We jumped out and started running through the dense trees. After coming to a distance, we saw Sarah talking to two more people with guns. We were right. Sarah was trying to lure us. The two started running towards us. They were searching us with flashlights. We stood still as trees in the cold winter. They were shouting, telling us they came here to help. We knew it was all a lie, but then Jake stepped on a dry twig and it snapped. We were found. Terrified, we started to run. The men followed behind us. They were yelling at us to stop or they would shoot us, but we didn't. We came to the clearing and headed toward the highway. Panting, we tried to look back, but we didn't see anyone. It was as if the two men had disappeared. It didn't make sense. Why did they stop following us? I was thinking if they were waiting to sneak up on us, but then my gaze shifted across the other side of the road. It was a police station. We understood why they'd stopped. Without thinking, we ran into the station. 2 officers were sitting at their desks, half asleep. We told them everything. The officers were kind and gave us warm blankets. We were relieved. After some time, the search unit came and we took them to the scene. But there was no sign of Sarah or anyone. Even our broken-down car was gone, as if it had never been there. It's been 10 years, but we never found the car or any trace of Sarah or the 2 men.